So much, Shobhikda, Dr. Bandyopadhyay, for introducing me. And thank you, Shubhajit, for inviting me to deliver a lecture in this series. It's my privilege to be speaking in front of all of you today. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Let me put it up first, and then I begin. Um, okay, so this is the title of my presentation, How to Write the History of War. And I know that this 8-day workshop, the theme of it is methodological, thematic issues of history writing, and I will be speaking about the history of war from that perspective. How can we think about the history of war? How do we write it? What are the kinds of issues that usually come up and potentially could come up in writing, in thinking about a history of war? This is what I'm going to talk about. Broadly speaking, I've divided this presentation into 5 themes. The first is the theme that comes up most often in writing the history of war, which is combat. History of battles, history of sieges, history of other kinds of military engagements. And I'll briefly touch upon that. But I'm more interested in bringing forward 4 less conventional themes in the writing of the history of war. And all of these are themes that I work with in my work. And these are environment, labor, animals, and gender. And I will discuss how we can get beyond the more popular theme of combat, more popular when we write about the history of war or military history, and how we can get into the less conventional, and for me at least, more interesting themes of environment and labor and animals and gender. So, this is the layout of today's presentation, what I will talk about for the next 1 hour or so. I'll not stretch beyond that, and then we can have discussion where I can bring up more themes. Mostly, or at least for the first 4 of these 5 themes, I'll talk in terms of my immediate specialization, which is the history of the Mughal Empire. And I will show you a series of paintings produced at the Mughal court at different points of time, mainly the 16th and 17th centuries, which will give us clues into how to think about war in terms of these topics: combat, environment, labor, and animals. For the last theme, gender, I'll dip into more contemporary wars. In particular, some of the wars from the 20th century, the First World War, the Second World War, and the Spanish Civil War, to talk about how to think about gender in the writing of the history of war. So, this is the plan for the next 1 hour, and hopefully, the interweaving of the visual images and the discussion about them will illustrate the points that I want to make. Now, the point of departure, let me start. The point of departure for this topic is thinking about war in terms of what is the most popular category in the writing of war, which is combat. It's very striking that most historians of war here share a similarity with filmmakers. If we think of any war movie that we may have seen, we will recall that most of war movies is actually about fighting. Here is one image from this movie called Jodha Akbar that came out some 20 years back. Some of us may have seen it. Here we see Hrithik Roshan, riding a horse, acting as Emperor Akbar, and all the soldiers in shining armor following behind him. This is the archetypical way in which war gets represented in movies. kings, queens, emperors, soldiers, horses, arms, and ammunition, and all of that. Even in the previous mega Mughal movie, Mughal-e-Azam, we see Prithviraj Kapoor and Dilip Kumar, fighting each other on the battlefield as Akbar and the future King Jahangir. This is the way war comes to us through movies, and it's very interesting that within the more academic field of military history also, like movie directors and movie producers, historians often choose to think about war in terms of the act of fighting, battles, sieges, etc. While many other topics which are related to the history of war get far little attention, and that's what the four other themes are about: environment, labor, animals, and gender. This does not mean that combat in itself is not important. It is very important. Let's look at this painting from the 1580s, late 1580s at the Mughal court. This is an illustration from Baburnama. Babur's grandson Akbar, the third Mughal emperor, got the Baburnama translated from Turkish to Persian. And this painting accompanied that manuscript as an illustration. This is an illustration of the first battle of Panipat. Here we see Babur in yellow armor, right bang in the center of the painting, surrounded by his soldiers. The artist, the painter, in fact a group of painters who used to work on these paintings at the Mughal court, brings out a variety of details. It's hard to miss all the warriors running around him, charging at the enemy. The war musicians on top of the painting here, beating drums and blowing into these trumpets, war trumpets. And it is also hard to miss the two types of cannons in front of Babur. The cannons on top, the three, are smaller ones, so they are mounted on wagons with two wheels, whereas the cannons at the bottom here are larger ones, so they are mounted on top of carriages that have four wheels because they are bigger and heavier. Together, what this allows us to understand is that it gives us a visual representation of some of the stuff that Mughal chronicles mention. Babur himself wrote about the Battle of Panipat, and subsequently Abul Fazl, when he was writing the history of Akbar, Akbarnama, he also wrote about the first Battle of Panipat. And all those textual references, the paintings give us an opportunity to visualize them and understand how things might have looked like. Babur, with his combination of the hand gunners, artillery, and different kinds of cavalry in the battlefield, and how that combination helped him win the early wars. This is a very interesting and important way, I would say, of thinking about war in terms of fighting. So, not to discount the importance of the history of combat. More paintings reveal more information about this kind of combat. This is a painting from the mid 17th century, illustrating the Mughal battle in Balkh. This was undertaken during the reign of the fifth Mughal emperor Shah Jahan. And it shows the Mughal army on the right fighting the Uzbek army on the left. And immediately it reminds us of a lot of stuff we know from literary sources, the chronicles, which, for example, tell us about how the Mughals fought mainly as heavy cavalry. They would fight with swords and shields and spears, and they would try to come close to the enemy in order to engage them in combat. The Uzbeks, on the other hand, they were nomads. So they would fight much more with bows and arrows, shooting arrows at the enemy from a distance. And that is precisely what comes out through this particular painting. As we see all the Mughal soldiers, the artists depict them charging with open swords and shields and spears. Whereas on the left, the Uzbeks, we find mainly shooting arrows from horseback. Now, this was a very difficult technique to execute. But the Uzbeks, because they were nomads, they were able to do it. So the combination of literary sources and the paintings help us understand these nuances of the history of combat, which is also, of course, very important in studying the history of war. If we proceed further, we know much about how the Mughals, for example, captured fortresses. These are called sieges, siege warfare. And we know a lot from the literary chronicles about the different techniques the Mughals used to capture fortresses. They would dig mines underneath the fortresses and stuff them with gunpowder, and then blow up those mines to destroy the fortifications above the ground, and then the hollow cavities that would be created they would use to storm the fortress. And here in the painting from around the 1590s, this is an illustration of the Akbarnama, which shows the siege of Chittor that happened in 1567-68. A very similar image comes up. So, juxtaposing the literary chronicles with these paintings, we get a sense of how the actual siege might have looked like. An assemblage of soldiers of different kinds, soldiers fighting on foot, soldiers fighting on elephants, soldiers fighting on horses, and the various military techniques that they used. Last but not the least, in my work, I also discovered that the Mughals had to often fight on water. And again, this is a painting from the Akbarnama from 1590s that shows Mughals engaging their adversaries on the river Ganga in today's Uttar Pradesh. We see soldiers on these boats. There are no horses anymore, but the soldiers shoot at each other using bows and arrows and using guns. Again, this allows us to think about the actual dynamics of war. And I'm coming to the environment part of it in the next topic very soon. But the literary chronicle and the painting together helps us see this other form of war. Not a battle on large fields, not a siege to capture big stone fortifications, but engaging each other on the river, which was particularly popular in the riverine country of ours in Bengal. The juxtaposition of the literary chronicle and the visual image help us understand this kind of history. So overall, what the first theme that I'm talking about, what emerges, is that one way to think about the history of war, one way to write the history of war could be about the history of combat in its various nuances. But, as I said, this is the more popular way, the more traditional way of thinking about the history of war. For me, what interests me is alternate ways of thinking about war, and here I will take you to the second topic of today's lecture, which is the history of environment. Now, this is a painting from the mid-17th century of the siege of Hooghly in West Bengal, very close to Kolkata. The Portuguese had a settlement since the 16th century. There was a disagreement with Shah Jahan about certain things. I'm not going into the details of the political history, but Shah Jahan decided that we have to evict the Portuguese from Hooghly. The result was a massive siege of the town of Hooghly, and the Mughals won. They evicted the Portuguese from Hooghly. Now, here is a snippet of the heterogeneities of Mughal warfare. Often, when earlier historians have written about the history of Mughal warfare, they have mainly talked about it in terms of battles and sieges. What I inevitably realized in the course of my research is that environment had a big role in molding the form of war. I discovered that the battles were particularly effective and recurrent where there were large rolling plains like in North India, from Punjab in the west through Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, even the western parts of Bengal where there were large rolling plains. The Mughals were able to engage their enemies in a series of large battles and small skirmishes. But this changed as they entered central India and the Deccan. These parts, with hills, with plateaus, with forests, had far more fortresses. In fact, any of us who have been to different parts of India, to tourist destinations, if I was to ask you that can you name some of the famous forts of India, most of us would name things like Chittor, Jodhpur, Ranthambore, Asirgarh, Daulatabad, Golconda, Bijapur, Bidar, and all of these fortresses are in this hilly, plateauy region of western India, central India, and the Deccan and southern India. This is because the hills, the plateaus, the forests offered a lot of the naturally defensible locations to local groups. Think of Shivaji and the Marathas, for example. Taking advantage of the hills, the steep hills of the Western Ghats, Shivaji constructed a network of fortresses, which gave such a hard time to the Mughal forces. So, what I realized in my work is that as the Mughals went into these different kinds of terrain, the forested, the plateauy, the hilly terrain, they encountered these fortresses that the local powers had already built in these different areas. And then warfare took the form, it had to take the form much more of siege warfare and much less of these big pitched battles. And all of that changed completely as the Mughals ventured into areas that were much more riverine. Think of Sindh in Pakistan. Think of the Brahmaputra basin in today's Assam. And most familiar to most of us here, think of the many rivers of Bengal. The Mughals realized that neither could they do these very large pitched battles, which would require very vast open plains, nor could they use their siege techniques because Bengal, the land of rivers and silt and mud, did not have these massive forts that they could besiege and conquer. So, military engagement took the form of riverine engagement, which is exactly what we see in this mid 17th century painting in front of us. The siege of Hooghly was an amphibious campaign. Partly the forces came by land, and partly the forces came by the river. So, in the painting, we see the town of Hooghly in the distance, and in front, all the Mughal war boats carrying soldiers, carrying cannons, carrying supplies for the troops who were besieging the fort of Hooghly. The Shahjahani chronicles tell us that some of the Portuguese were killed in the engagement, some of them fled and went further down the Bhagirathi Hooghly towards Holdia. Much like the British in 1757 when they were driven out of Calcutta by Siraj-ud-Dowla, the Portuguese also fled downstream the Bhagirathi Hooghly, but a lot of them were captured and taken to the Mughal court. So this particular painting, the way I am using it here in front of you, is to draw your attention to how the form of Mughal warfare would change depending on the terrain that it would interact with, and how the riverine terrain of Bengal and Assam and Sindh would bring out these amphibious campaigns. And if we were to think that it's only the environment that was molding warfare, we have to pause and think again, because military campaigns also shaped environment. Armies in course of military campaigns had to cross rivers, so they had to bridge these rivers. Sometimes they encountered these forests and they had to go through the forests, so some of the forests needed to be cut down for the road to be built. Ground was often rocky and rugged, and the Mughals had to deploy these beldars or pioneers to flatten the ground so that they could march forward. Campaigning armies used a lot of environmental resources like food grains, like animals, like water. And in doing all of this, armies were also molding the environment as environment was molding military campaigns. So, in my work, especially my first book, Climate of Conquest, what I argue is that the relationship between war and environment was a two-way process where they molded each other. This, then, I would suggest, could be another way to think about and write about the history of war, going beyond combat and studying the nuances of environment and war interactions, bringing in the question of environment in the discussion of war. Today, when we look at the wars happening all around us, be it the genocidal war in Gaza or the war in Ukraine, we often talk about the environmental impact of these wars over these countries. Well, during the 16th, 17th centuries under Mughals, they did not have this devastating an effect that today armies can have. But nevertheless, war did have an impact on the environment. But what I'm arguing is that it's not just about the impact of war on environment, it is also the impact of environment on war, a two-way process, environmental factors shaping war and military processes shaping environment. This is a different kind of history of war that emerges when we look at these literary sources and paintings. I will now go to the third theme of the lecture, which is the question of labor. If we look over the different narratives of war in the Mughal chronicles and look at the different paintings of war generated by the Mughal court, we realize that war was not just about the brave and glorious warriors and soldiers and arms and cannons and all. Of course, those were very important. But war was also about the more anonymous, the more poor, the more non-elite participants of war, who were the logistical laborers. War constantly needed these logistical tasks to be fulfilled. Just like I mentioned, bridging a river so that the army could march forward, cutting down some trees so that a road could be built, flattening the ground so that the troops could proceed. Sometimes there would be snow on the ground, especially in Afghanistan or Kashmir. And that snow had to be removed from the ground so that the army could march ahead. And in doing all of this, the beldars, the pioneers, the road builders, the stone cutters became very, very important. In sieges, and that's the painting we have in front of us, similarly, these logistical workers became very, very important. This is a painting again from the 1590s. It shows the siege of Chittor from about 25 years back. And it shows the building of siege works, the construction of mines and saps so that the Mughal troops could come closer to the fort and besiege it successfully. On top of the painting, we see the fortress and the garrison firing their cannons at the Mughals. The Mughals are the people in front of us. And on top of the top right, we see the Mughal commanders also shooting cannons and guns at the fortress. But what I would draw your attention is the lower half of the painting, where we see the workmen at work. One remembers the Bangla poem, Ora Kaj Kore, and or they work. And this is a universal theme which is generally neglected by historians of war and also neglected by Mughal chroniclers, by the way. But from these bits and pieces of information, we get an idea about their involvement, about their contribution. People carrying stones on their head, unskilled labor, of course. People shoveling the ground to take earth out and construct something. People working, masons, stone masons working to erect these temporary walls behind which the soldiers could take shelter. People mixing mortar probably to erect these walls. The bhisti or the water carrier scattering water so that the mixture could be made. All of these people were as important in the carrying out of military campaigns as the soldiers and the commanders were. If we think about it, if these poor workmen, neglected in Mughal sources and neglected by modern historians, if they did not do their part, if they did not do the digging, the cutting, the breaking, the constructing, then the soldiers would not have any opportunity to fight at all. So these people were very, very important in the prosecution of military campaigns. A different group becomes visible when we look at the case of the construction of the fort. Just a minute. So much, Shobhikda, Dr.